Good evening. I've not hosted a Twitter Spaces in quite some time, and we'll be talking about a very illuminating subject that has been brought to my attention the last 2 months, and very few people have been reporting on it. And that is the story of Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who was a Navy JAG officer at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba in 2006. And the reports coming from former detainees like Mansour Adiev, who have been tortured by DeSantis. Unfortunately, this has not gotten a lot of traction in the media. One of the very few people to cover this story extensively was Mike Preisner of the Empire Files and Dan Christensen of FloridaBulldog.org. Dan Christensen is one of the more authoritative and reputable sources relating to the events of September 11, 2001. And I had the pleasure of interviewing him for my podcast, The Darkened Hour. And so back in December 2nd, 2022, the Real News Network under Mike Preisner interviewed the former Yemeni prisoner at Guantanamo Bay, Mansour Ahmad Saad al-Daif, who, by the way, was held without charge in Guantanamo Bay detention camp in Cuba from February 9th, 2002 to July 11th, 2016. When Preisner interviewed him, he began to say that he was receiving very abusive treatment at Guantanamo Bay. And Mansour Adiev would say, quote, "We were beaten all day long. There's a team. Whatever you do, they just hear you. Pepper spray, beating, sleep deprivation." That continued for 3 months. And he was there because at the beginning, he told us that he was there to ensure we are treated humanely. He's talking of DeSantis. And if we have concerns or issues, he will take it. But he's one of the people who actually supervised the torture, the abuse, and the beating all the time at Guantanamo. End quote. Preisner actually, in a follow-up question, asked Adiev, so Ron DeSantis, he wasn't just there as a lawyer that you could go to. He was actually supervising torture, beatings, and he was supervising these force feedings of you and others, in which Mansour Adiev responded, quote, "Ron DeSantis was there all the time because his job was to walk around and talk to prisoners in the camp. That was the job because the report is like, I am here to ensure you're being treated humanely." And I'm like, I'm telling you, Americans, if this is humanity, this guy is a torturer. He's a criminal, end quote. Now, Mike Preisner actually was one of the very few journalists, independent journalists, who shed light on the very dark and nefarious military career of Governor DeSantis. But Dan Christensen went a little bit further in his latest report on Florida Bulldog just 2 days ago, in which Ron DeSantis was a lieutenant commander and JAG lawyer at the U.S. Navy who was serving at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba and Fallujah during the Iraq War. Now, according to Christensen, not much is known about DeSantis' duties at those locations because DeSantis has only released limited highlights of his military career. And in a recent speech, he once stated that he spent Christmas 2006 at Guantanamo without his family, and he has repeatedly declined any interviews about it. And Dan Christensen, being a dutiful reporter that he is, he actually contacted DeSantis about an interview regarding his service at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and in Fallujah, and he refused. Now, of course, in DeSantis' own biography, which is cited by Wikipedia, he actually touts that he still serves in the U.S. Navy Reserves, but that the Navy says otherwise. And what you're led to believe is that he's either lying or he's still serving as a officer in the Navy Reserves, and the Navy declines to acknowledge this for whatever reason. But according to Florida Bulldog, there's a Navy data sheet about DeSantis, which lists his separation date from the Navy as February 14, 2019, which is, of course, a month after his inauguration. And a Navy spokeswoman, Lieutenant Allison Hands, said, quote, "He is not active or reserve. He's not a member of the Navy anymore," end quote. Now, back in 2018, 42 pages of heavily censored U.S. Navy records were released to the Florida Phoenix, which is a nonprofit news site which is free of advertising for people to read. At Guantanamo, where hundreds of people were, of course, scooped up by the Bush administration into war on terror and held indefinitely without trial and sometimes without charge, like Mansour Adiev, they reported that from March 2006 through early January 2007, quote, DeSantis' primary duty was a trial counsel, meaning a prosecutor. The record also showed that DeSantis was described as a Joint Terrorism Task Force Gitmo scheduler, administrative officer, end quote. The Tampa Bay Times reported that same year that several retired naval officers who served at the detention camp at the same time as DeSantis, including some who worked with them, said his role with the Judge Advocate General Corps, which is JAG, also known as JAG for short, quote, was to advocate for the fair and humane treatment of detainees to ensure the U.S. military complied with the law, end quote. Now, I could tell you right now that the CIA at these black sites and at Guantanamo Bay, black sites that were found to be all over Europe and in Afghanistan, Iraq, Poland, Germany, Egypt, that the rule of law did not apply. And that's the reason why those black sites were outside the United States. Now, Guantanamo Bay is not in the United States. It's in Cuba. Even though it's on U.S. land, because the area of Guantanamo Bay is under U.S. control, it's not within the Department of Justice territory. And you have to ask yourself, why do we use this area as a prison when we could have just had people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ramzi bin al-Shibh, Walid bin Attash, also known as Khalid? Why weren't they in U.S. prisons under federal jurisdiction, like the Southern District of New York? This is where the crime happened here. Well, that's only because the CIA tortured these people under protection of the White House. And they couldn't do it in the United States because it's illegal. Now, again, according to Dan Christian at the Florida Bulldog, Mansour Adiev, and I'm hoping I'm saying his last name correctly, Adefi, I think, basically, who is known as Prisoner 441, said that DeSantis was indeed not just observing, but he allowed and participated in illegal acts of torture, which was to help put down the hunger strike in 2006, which was under dozens of detainees protesting their detention. And DeSantis, according to Adifi, covered up the torture. At one point, this is from Adifi's own testimony, quote, Ron DeSantis was there and watching us. We were crying, screaming. We were tied to the feeding chair. And that guy, he was watching that. He was laughing, basically, when they used to feed us because our stomach cannot hold this amount of Ensure. They used to pour Ensure, one can after another. And for those who don't know what Ensure is, it's a nutritional shake. And that they would feed the detainees who were strapped to this chair, Ensure, one can after another. So when DeSantis approached Adifi, he said, this is the way you deserve to be treated. You should start to eat. And Adifi threw up in his face, literally on his face, end quote. Now, Adifi did not previously know DeSantis's name. And like all other JAG lawyers, they don't use their real names while stationed at Gitmo. And according to Mark Denebro, who's the lead lawyer for Abu Zubaydah, he is quoted on record saying, quote, nobody does down there. They'll use Greek mythological characters or Indian names or make up names. They don't want the detainees or anyone else to know who they are. That secrecy is a big problem. I never seen that reported, end quote. But according to Joseph Hickman, who's a former U.S. Army team leader and sergeant of the guard at Guantanamo Bay Prison, he said that DeSantis was using a number and that people recognized him immediately because he was a very young man then. He was very good looking, had a nice look, looked like a jock, and that he would be running on the base. And that's how he stood out. And that retired Navy Captain Patrick McCarthy, who is a staff judge who supervised DeSantis during his time at Guantanamo Bay, well, he told the Tampa Bay Times in 2018 that, quote, he was one of the folks I recall vividly, a can-do guy and a young officer I could trust and rely on. He had very good judgment, end quote. And later on, the paper even reported that DeSantis was among one of the officers who traveled to and from Guantanamo on at least 3 short temporary assignments, a few weeks or months in length as part of the detention center's legal arm. And Captain McCarthy and his team were charged with ensuring the detainees received rights afforded under the Department of Defense regulations and policies, as well as Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, which provides rules on how to humanely treat detainees like those at Guantanamo Bay. But these rights afforded, like in Common Article 2 and 3 of the Geneva Conventions, were not afforded to them at black sites in Europe, for example, or in the Middle East, because they had no rights. And when you torture somebody, you'll say anything. So whether, for example, if Khalid Sheikh Mohammed admitted his part to the September 11th attacks, for example, well, how do we know it's true, right? He's tortured. He could be telling the truth, but we won't know. And unless this trial comes forward, we'll never know. And this is what's going on with DeSantis. Now, DeSantis himself, according to Mike Preisner and Dan Christensen, well, he didn't torture for information. He basically tortured for much more nefarious reasons, which was basically self-gratification, which makes him even worse on a moral or lack thereof platform. And to go back to Mansour Hadifi, when he was captured in January 2002, according to the Florida Bulldog, he was actually labeled a high-risk threat and thought to be something of a prize. But in 2008, the Department of Defense assessment states, and I posted this on my WordPress, quote, detainee is an admitted member of Al-Qaeda who possessed prior knowledge of the September 11 attacks as well as other planned attacks against U.S. interests. Detainee was identified as a commander of evacuating frontline forces, assessed to be Osama bin Laden's 55th Arab Brigade during hostilities against U.S. and coalition forces, and was in direct communication with Osama bin Laden, end quote. But on October 28, 2015, the Guantanamo Review Board determined that Hadifi, who learned English while a prisoner, much in the same fashion as Mohammed Aoud Slahi, who a film was made about him, and I did a podcast called The Mauritanian. He also learned English like Guantanamo, should be released. And in the Guantanamo Review Board's final determination, quote, to a country other than Yemen with appropriate security assurances, end quote. Well, if he's not charged with a crime, how is he a threat? And according to Mansour Hadifi's own account, he wasn't captured on the battlefield. He actually traveled to Afghanistan as a teacher's research assistant and was kidnapped by Afghan warlords and held for ransom. Now, this was the problem with a lot of these detainees at Guantanamo Bay, and that's why Andy Worthington's book details the account of a lot of these detainees, which is called the Guantanamo Files, a great book, by the way. A British historian, Andy Worthington, fantastic book, I recommend. Details that a lot of these people were actually prisoners of warring Afghan clans who sold these people to Western intelligence agencies or the military, or to other Afghan warlords for a price, and they sold them off. With his interview in the Eyes Left podcast, Hadifi himself gave more further details about how he was tortured, abused by DeSantis, either from watching and monitoring the torture or to basically personally become involved. But his story is suppressed by major media, and that's because DeSantis is a very influential and high-powered governor in the Republican Party. and we're not going to get any type of cooperation. I mean, we haven't had any cooperation from the federal government or the Department of Justice overall. I mean, we do have some very honorable FBI agents who came out through Operation Encore, which I've covered, and other former whistleblowers like Mark Rossini and Colleen Rowley, Robert Wright Jr., and Ken Williams, who tried to warn about intelligence that could have stopped 9/11, which was suppressed. In this case, regarding DeSantis, is ADF lying? Well, I don't think so. I think he's telling the truth. And this is backed up by former Guantanamo Bay employees and the Department of the Navy at some point that DeSantis was there. Now, what's the goal of DeFi to lie about DeSantis? There is none. He didn't even know who he was until he saw him recently. And then he started giving interviews with Mike Preisner and a couple of others, but not through the legacy media, because they don't want to cover anything detailing any federal government cover-up regarding the torture and rendition program led by the CIA. And you know, when you look at this in the whole context about why someone like DeSantis would do this, well, I mean, look at how many people within the CIA were conducting their own brand of torture. At sites like Detention Site Green or Detention Site Blue, which were CIA black sites. And we're starting to get a better picture along the way when you have the Senate Select Committee who investigated this matter, and there was a good movie with Adam Driver called The Report, talking about the CIA's rendition and torture program. And, you know, I wonder whether we'll get any type of further information regarding DeSantis' own history, which you're not going to get from DeSantis himself. Or whether we'll have more people like Mike Preisner or Maximilian Alvarez, who is the editor-in-chief at the Real News Network. When Alvarez actually interviewed Mike Preisner, they talked about how that Preisner had researched DeSantis' military background, and that they were making the point that there's obviously something there that's really sketchy. And then Mansour Adifi actually responded to Preisner, and they recorded an interview. So Preisner went further, and he actually tried to dig into DeSantis' military background. And according to his own words at Real News, when Maximilian Alvarez interviewed him, he said, quote, "I think from some progressive-ish or Democratic Party style military publications, they're all kind of mock this as it's because DeSantis did nothing. He uses this photo of himself in Fallujah, but he was just a pencil pusher who never did anything, and they don't look at the Guantanamo thing. He was just some JAG officer. They call him in the military, Jagoff. I like the name. Who sits behind a desk and trying to make himself look cool with this photo, but there's really nothing to be looked into in his past that he didn't really think of that. The Democrat, you know, nobody wanted to talk about it. I thought there had to be something more. And I realized that the only press that actually did try to dig into some of his military history was local Florida press when he first ran for governor in 2018, end quote. And that is one of the reporters is Dan Christensen of Florida Bulldog. And I do want to mention his name because he deserves a lot more credit than he's getting publicly. And so does Mike Preisner, who's a much more bigger name than Christensen, and he deserves a lot of credit for recovering this story. And through some recent Freedom of Information Act requests, they acquired military documents and talked to Navy spokespeople, the Florida press. And they interviewed even former colleagues of his, which I named some of them through the Florida Bulldog's own report, who served in Fallujah with him in Guantanamo Bay. So there is a connection. So this ain't a made-up story. But what else can we know? I mean, there's very little. But nobody wants to talk about the rendition torture program anymore. People say, well, it's much too late. There's other pressing matters. But this is a huge, huge story because these people are still alive and they still should be held accountable for what they did. And here's a guy who tortured detainees, and he is a governor of Florida. He's actually a governor. Now, this is not a condemnation of the Republican Party, because on the other side of that, you have the Barack Obama administration with Vice President Biden, who basically shied away initially when it came to the torture program. Now, later on, he forced the ending of it, but that wasn't the case in his second administration. I mean, his first administration. So unless we have some very influential, high-powered names to talk about this stuff, I mean, very few people in the alt media will cover it. And I'm not a big name at all, but very few people will cover the detention and torture program under the CIA, which was held under the Bush-Obama administrations. And so hopefully this audio will be heard by certain people, because it really needs to be given the proper attention regarding what DeSantis did and how much did he do. And unless we have other detainees who will come out and say what happened, there's very few. Not many people want to come out and relive these horrors. Then this story will not be given the attention it sorely deserves. And so I will end the audio there. Have a good night.